What's up, everyone, and welcome back to Christmas. Here we are, part 3 of our 3-part secret history of Santa Claus. We previously took a look at how the Protestant Reformation caused St. Nicholas to splinter into a number of secular gift bringers. Last time we looked at the Puritan Revolution outlawing Christmas and Father Christmas refusing to stand down. This time we are looking finally at American-style Christmas, including the big guy right here. So, I mean, from a modern perspective, probably no country has influenced Christmas more than the United States. I mean, on a global scale, on a historical scale, Germany is important. England is important. That's why we're talking about these other countries. But from a modern perspective, since the 20th century, the big influencer has been the United States. I mean, like American-style secular Christmas with Santa Claus, Frosty, Rudolph, elves, all that stuff has spread not only through countries who once centered their celebrations on much older traditions, but also for countries for whom Christmas isn't traditional at all, like Japan, for example. And of course, we've seen no shortage of Christmas gift bringers that have become increasingly Santa-esque over the last century. We saw the Yule Tomten become more like Santa, Weihnachten becomes more like Santa, Olencero becomes more like Santa, and so on. So, I mean, that raises the question then, how did Christmas start in America? Like, if you were to travel back to the original 13 colonies, would you see Christmas being celebrated, like, publicly and as ubiquitously as it is today, as indicated by this modern photo from colonial Williamsburg? No, the answer is no. The short answer is no. Of course not. Of course it wasn't. The long answer, however, is it depends on the colony, right? The original 13 colonies, they were different. An important thing to remember about those colonies is that they were generally settled by different religious groups, which is to say, different Christian denominations. You had the Puritans, aka the Congregationalists. You had Lutherans. You had Calvinists, such as Presbyterians. You had Catholics, and so on, right? Like these the different colonies were generally of one religion or the other. It was an exception for there to be a mixture, and so the primary denomination of your colony might profoundly influence the way that Christmas was viewed there. So let's take a look at the different colonies. I want to start with the southern colonies because they're the easiest ones to talk about. The first permanent English settlement in America, of course, was the Jamestown Colony, you might have heard of, settled in 1608 by English Cavaliers led by Captain John Smith from Pocahontas, right? The Cavaliers were royalists, meaning that they took the side of the Crown and the Church of England against the Puritans during the English Civil War. So they were Anglicans, and as a result, they loved Christmas. It's recorded that they, quote, properly observed their first Christmas in the New World by, quote, feasting on fish, oysters, and game they had caught. The English settlers in the rest of the southern colonies as well brought with them traditions like the Yule log, ringing bells, feasting, singing carols, so on. A big part of the reason why Christmas in the old style was able to continue unabated like that in the southern colonies was that the southern colonies were rural, just like medieval England had been, right? If you remember, in medieval England, Christmas was a big deal because it was a break from working in the fields. Everybody could come to the Lord's Manor and so on. Now you could do a similar thing with a plantation. The difference is you had slaves instead of just like serfs. It's maybe a minor detail, but no, it's not. It's a major detail. But anyway, you can see how the rural lifestyle of the South would allow for the old-style medieval Christmas traditions to continue. So the Anglican South, eventually the Episcopalian South, was good with Christmas. But, we all know who landed in the North. The Pilgrims that we all celebrate every November were separatist Puritans who landed in Plymouth in 1620. And like the English Puritans, those who founded what would become known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony and eventually just Massachusetts, they didn't care for Christmas or Easter or Pentecost at all, like we talked about last week, because it was non-biblical, it was Catholic, it was pagan, it was nonsense, it was whatever, right? It was foolishness. So an early sign of the dislike of Christmas came in 1621 when William Bradford, the governor of the Plymouth colony, scolded a group of young men who were taking Christmas Day off from work in order to play a little ball game. Don't do that. You got to work on Christmas, or else you're a Catholic, I guess. But after the English Puritans banned Christmas back in England, Massachusetts followed their lead. In 1659, a law was enacted to punish anyone found observing Christmas by feasting or taking time off work with a fine of 5 shillings, which I guess was a lot, probably. But even after Christmas was restored in England, the colonies of New England continued to hate Christmas until after the Revolutionary War, partly because they associated it with the Anglican Church. Besides Massachusetts, the other colonies in New England were either Presbyterians or the newly formed Rhode Island denomination known as the Baptists, of whom you may have heard, and all of them considered Christmas to be strongly anti-biblical, so all of those New England colonies were like, no thank you on Christmas. But while New England and the southern colonies were largely settled by the two opposing sides of the English Civil War, the middle colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, they were more of a melting pot. Right? In addition to Anglicans coming from England, you also had German and Scandinavian Lutherans, you had Dutch Reformed church members from the Netherlands, and of course English, Irish, and German Catholics largely settling in Maryland. The state's so Catholic, they named it after, the Catholic lady. Each one of these cultures, they all kind of melted into, that might not be true. I probably shouldn't say that. I don't know what Maryland's named after. Maybe it's a queen or something. I don't know. Pretend it was a joke if it's not true. I'm not going to pause this recording to look it up. Don't correct me. I love you. Goodbye. Okay. So each one of these different cultures they all kind of blend into the others and create a uniquely American Christmas. The prominence of Sinterklaas traditions in Dutch New Amsterdam is probably overstated in a lot of histories of Christmas for a number of reasons. Partly because, A, the Dutch colonists who came to America in 1625 were Protestants. They would not have been celebrating St. Nicholas. And the more secular style Sinterklaas that we talked about in the past, those traditions kind of arose in the 19th century. So the ones who came over in the 17th century didn't do the things that happened in the 19th century later, you see. But also, the English took over New Amsterdam, renamed it New York, you might have heard of that, in 1664. So by 1800, the Dutch represented less than 2% of the total American population. So while I'm not saying that the Dutch had nothing to do with the development of Santa Claus, they definitely did, especially in New York they did, but I'm saying the credit that they traditionally receive is it's overstated a little bit. That's all I'm saying. But the real Christmas heroes in America were not the Dutch, but the Pennsylvania Dutch, that is to say the Deutsch, the Germans. By 1800, more than 300,000 Germans had immigrated to Pennsylvania, and in the following century, about 7 million more would join them. So many of these immigrants brought with them their local Christmas traditions, especially Belsnickels, seen here, Kris Kringle, who we talked about before, who were two of the most popular post-Reformation gift bringers. But as I mentioned before, the name Kris Kringle gets mangled by non-immigrant American ears and tongues into names like Kris Kinkle and eventually Kris Kringle. And, once you have a gift bringer with a man's name, you have the image of this man, and so the name Kris Kringle kind of gets applied to the fur-wearing, beard-having bringer of gifts. Belsnickel, you combine the image of Belsnickel with the name Kris Kringle, and then in Pennsylvania, Kris Kringle is the name that sticks for quite some time. Um, Belsnickel, nevertheless, managed to maintain a presence in Pennsylvania as both a gift bringer, but also as a tradition of Pennsylvanian-style mumming. If you remember, we talked about mumming, dressing in costumes and doing little formulaic plays. This style of mumming became known as belsnickeling, and people who did it were known as belsnickelers. Youths in costumes, they would go door to door, and they would perform a song or a short mummer-style play, generally on the themes of death and resurrection, like mummers' plays generally are, in exchange for food and drink. You get really drunk, you get really rowdy. Boys in masks. There you go. But one last group of immigrants who had an outsized influence on American Christmas traditions were the Moravians, which are a group from an eastern part of what is now the Czech Republic. You can see them there in green. They settled in Pennsylvania, notably the city of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which was founded on Christmas Eve, but also North Carolina. And two of their biggest contributions to Christmas traditions are the Moravian Star, which you might have seen, a colorful, complexly shaped, previously paper, now often plastic, like you can see here, star hung on Christmas trees or elsewhere as a decoration, and also the Putz, which despite its unfortunate name, is actually a large, elaborate nativity scene that might fill an entire room with model buildings and animals and simulated hills and flying angels and such. So those are the Moravians. Anyway, as I said, the colonies in New England, they carried on their Puritan disdain for Christmas until the Revolutionary War. Somewhat famously, you might have heard of this guy, George Washington. He was able to get the jump on German mercenaries, the Hessians, during the Battle of Trenton on December 26, because the Christmas-loving Germans had been celebrating Christmas, and the Puritan Americans had not. So he caught them off guard that way. It was a major moment in the Revolutionary War. But at any rate, the American Puritans eased up on Christmas after the war, partly because they no longer felt that celebration was being controlled by their hated Church of England. But nevertheless, throughout the newly minted America, Christmas was seen as an English custom, and so it fell out of favor for a while. We're not English anymore. We're not going to do English things. But another reason that New Englanders didn't care too much for Christmas is that they already had their own harvest time holiday you might have heard of. Thanksgiving, as a day of feasting and relaxation, has a lot in common with Christmas, but it doesn't have the religious connotations that were so troubling for the Puritans. So it was much easier for them to accept. By the mid-1800s, after Abraham Lincoln, following much lobbying from a group of New Englanders, he declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. At that point, New Englanders softened on Christmas. It's very similar to the way that we talked about the Western and Eastern churches having a rift about, do we celebrate Christmas or Epiphany? And once they were like, let's do both, and it's 12 days, and they're like, cool, and that was cool. This was kind of the same thing. Once we do Thanksgiving and Christmas, yeah, man, we're cool with Christmas now, basically. But, there's a lot of blanks to fill in between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War when it comes to American Christmas. A lot of books on the history of Christmas follow the same general framework when it comes to the development of Santa Claus as a figure. It's usually a straight line. They say you take Dutch traditions of St. Nicholas, which inspire Washington Irving, and he develops the character of Santa Claus in his book, A History of New York. And then this mythology is developed and popularized by Irving's friend Clarke Moore in his poem The Night Before Christmas. And then finally, the visual appearance of Santa was locked down by political cartoonist Thomas Nast, right? You've got Nicholas to Irving to Moore to Nast. The central argument of this book right here, Santa Claus Worldwide by Tom A. German, he talks about this Nicholas, Irving, Moore, Nast pipeline, and the central thesis of this book is that that theory is kind of bunk. Not that it's fully bunk, but that it's not the whole picture. And I completely agree. He's 100% right. This is a great book. You should check it out, by the way. It has been a great resource for these videos. It has a lot more information than I'm going over because it's a book and not a video. While it is true that these four elements, Sinterklaas, Washington Irving, A Night Before Christmas, and Thomas Nast illustrations, they are essential to Santa as we know him today, and we are going to talk about all of those things. But it's not as simple as A to B to C to D, right? It's not as simple as Washington Irving heard this thing and then he created Santa Claus, right? So, I mean, here's Washington Irving. Here he is. He's actually credited by many scholars straight out. They say he invented Santa Claus, more or less all on his own. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about how it was part of a conspiracy on his part with him and the New York Historical Society, because they were specifically trying to make New York-style Christmas a more child-centric family thing rather than a boisterous time where you got rowdy drinkers and Californian bands that I keep mentioning offhandedly and then not really talking about in an episode, but here's a picture of one. So Irving, who's most famous for writing The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, he wrote A History of New York under a pseudonym here of a fictional Dutch New Yorker named Dietrich Knickerbocker. And the popularity of this book, yes, is the origin of why Knickerbocker becomes a nickname for New Yorkers, and it is ultimately the source of the name for the New York Knicks. They're the New York Knickerbockers because they're New Yorkers, and the origin is this book. This book is a satire that glorifies in a tongue-in-cheek way the days in which New York was a Dutch colony, and then laments how the English ruined it. Right? That's the joke of the book, but it's it's satirical as much of Irving's stuff is. The book is peppered throughout with references to how the Dutch love St. Nicholas, including talking about how they came on a ship across the Atlantic with it, and the figurehead is St. Nicholas, right? But the main thing that we're concerned with is the part where he talks about how St. Nicholas comes to New York once a year, riding a white horse, pulling a wagon over the rooftops, dropping presents down the chimney. And so for many scholars, this is it. This is the proof that Irving invented Santa Claus. He heard about Sinterklaas, and then he was like, what about this, though? However, German, in his book, debunks this claim at great length that I don't have time to go into. He's got multiple chapters on it. It's very interesting. But one of the key pieces of evidence is that the first edition of A History of New York came out in 1809, and most of the St. Nicholas stuff, especially the stuff about St. Nicholas delivering gifts, didn't get added until a second edition in 1812. The reason why this is significant is that in 1810, a man named John Pintard published a broadside, which is basically a one-sheet newspaper, one-sided piece of paper, the kind of thing, that features a woodcut illustration. This is it, by the way. It features a woodcut illustration of St. Nicholas. Look at him here. And then, two kids, a little girl who was obviously nice, got some toys, a little boy got a Switch, right? It's got the Dutch version of the poem here that he heard it. It was a poem he heard, and he found an old Dutch woman who knew all the words, and he wrote it down. And then this translation here, St. Nicholas, good holy man, put on the tabard best you can, go clad therewith to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Hispania, where apples bright of Oranje, meaning oranges, and likewise those granata surnamed, pomegranates, roll through the street all free unclaimed, surnamed. Did I say surnamed? Surnamed. Roll through the streets all free unclaimed. St. Nicholas, my dear good friend, to serve you ever was my end. If you will now me something give, I'll serve you ever while I live. And the thing that's notable here is in the Dutch version, it might be hard to read, but it says Santa Claus. Santa Claus, not Sinterklaas, which you would expect in Dutch, but yeah. So this broadside inspires the publication of an even longer poem that appears in 3 different New York newspapers in the following weeks. The broadside and the newspaper poems all use the name Santa Claus to refer to St. Nicholas. So the fact that the 1809 edition of Irving's history did not contain the material that was previously thought to have inspired Pentard kind of proves the ultimate point, which is that Santa Claus wasn't the literary invention of any one person, but rather a folk figure that developed organically through an oral tradition. And the oral tradition is really clear in the fact that it takes a very long time to come up with, to solidify how you spell Santa Claus, right? Or how it's pronounced. That's how you end up with Santa Claus, stuff like that, and others that we're going to see. So this is further evidence, however, if you actually read Irving's history, right? Keep in mind it's a satire. The joke in the section about St. Nicholas is that in the Dutch glory days, back when it was New Amsterdam, Santa Claus used to come every day and give presents to everyone, not just children. And so now in dumb old English New York, he only comes once a year and only gives presents to kids, right? That's the joke, right? And that joke only makes sense if the people reading it are already familiar with the tradition of a gift-giving St. Nicholas, right? If you don't already know, like, Santa Claus comes once a year and brings gifts to kids, that joke doesn't make any sense. Right? So to me, the claim that Washington Irving invented Santa Claus, no good. No good. Additionally, in 1813, you got this book called False Stories Corrected, which is kind of a book for kids that ruins fairy tales and mythology by saying all of it is fake. A portion is about Jack Frost. You can see him illustrated here with very cool little bat wings. But it says that such a creature as Jack Frost never existed any more than old Santa Claus, of whom so often little children hear such foolish stories, and once a year they are encouraged to hang their stockings in the chimney at night, and when they arise in the morning, they will find in them cakes, nuts, money, etc., placed there by some of the family, which they are told old Santa Claus has come down the chimney and put in. It's spelled like Santa Claus. I said Clow the first time, but it's Claw, like C-L-A-W, with a hyphen. Old Santa Claus. The fact that some old party pooper felt that he had to debunk Santa Claus and spelled his name in a weird way is a very strong evidence for an oral tradition of Santa already being strong in New York by 1813. If it's very weird to think that Washington Irving invented Santa Claus in 1812, and a year later, somebody felt they had to publish a book debunking an old tradition. Anyway, this is Clement Moore. Let's talk about him. He was a professor of Greek literature, Greek and Eastern literature at a theological seminary in New York, but he is nonetheless best known these days for a poem he wrote to entertain his kids on Christmas Eve. You have probably heard it. It is, in fact, literally the most famous American poem of all time, being published more than any other. And it also very importantly serves to codify a lot of what we believe about Santa Claus even to this day, including settling some things that weren't, universal about Christmas celebration before it. So for example, like, when does the gift giver come? Does he come December 6th for St. Nicholas Day? Does he come Christmas Eve, Christmas morning? Does he come New Year? Does he come Epiphany? Settled. Christmas Eve. Does he visit you in person, or does he come when you're asleep? Settled. When you're asleep. Do we put out shoes or do we put out stockings? Settled. Stockings. Do you hang your stockings by the fireplace or on the corner of your bed? Settled. Fireplace. Bad news for parents who live in homes that don't have fireplaces. Didn't think about that one. Clement Moore. He also, of course, gives the definitive number and names of the reindeer that we still think of today. So Moore's poem was written in 1822 to be read to his kids on Christmas Eve, and then published anonymously in 1823 under the title An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, with this editorial preface you can see here saying, we know not to whom we are indebted for the following description of that unwearied patron of children, that homely but delightful personification of parental kindness, Santa Claus, S-A-N-T-E, Claus, you can see here, right? It does go on, but the statement and the name again implies that families are already familiar with this tradition. So it's already a thing by the time Clement Moore writes this poem this defining poem. But anyway, but here's the question though. How does Moore get from the St. Nicholas of the Pinter broadside that we saw here? We'll just jump back to that real fast if you want. There it is. Look at that. There he is with a stick and a beehive and a dog, you know, classic Santa Claus things. How does he get from that to his right jolly old elf dressed all in furs from his head to his foot, right, driving a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer? How does that come about? Well, you know, that doesn't match the Irving description from 1812 either, where he rides a white horse in a wagon. So the missing ingredient is that Moore was inspired by an 1821 children's book that was not very popular and was lost for a long time until a copy was found in the 20th century. It's called The Children's Friend Part 3, A New Year's Present to the Little Ones from 5 to 12, published by William B. Gilley. This book talks about a Christmas gift giver named Santa Claus. You can see the spelling here, one word with an E in the middle there, who goes from house to house in a sleigh pulled by a flying reindeer, slides down the chimney to give presents to children while they're sleeping. The poem ultimately ends, however, with Santa Claus leaving birch switches in the stockings of 2 naughty boys. The poem includes many elements that were previously attributed to Moore's more popular poem, like the reindeer, the fursuit, like a German Belsnickel fursuit, not a fursuit, a fursuit, not a fursuit. The long beard, coming on Christmas Eve, etc. Chances are extremely good that Moore bought this book but then rewrote the poem for his own kids because he didn't like the cruelness of it, right? It ends with the implication that boys are going to get whipped, right? So he wanted a more fun version for his own kids, so he wrote one. So for a long time it was believed, right, the poem was published anonymously, and it took like 15 years for Moore to say that he wrote the poem. Some people say this because somebody else actually wrote the poem. That's not true. Shut up. It's not a thing. But the one theory is that he was ashamed of it because he was a serious scholar and he didn't want to be famous for this, you know, children's fluff, right? However, once you realize how similar his poem is to The Children's Friend, the poem within it more accurately called Old Santa Claus with Much Delight, when you realize how similar they are, it seems possible he was waiting until William Gilley was dead so that he didn't get sued for ripping off his poem. And so it is true that he did not admit to writing it or publish it under his own name until after Gilley was dead. So anyway, Moore's poem was obviously way more popular than Gilley's. Gilley may not have even been the writer; he was the publisher. But Moore's poem was not immediately this big smash that it would become, right? In 1848, the poem was published under Moore's name, finally, in 1848, as a children's book with illustrations by T.C. Boyd. Boyd Santa, you can see here, he looks like a little Dutchman, not very Santa-esque, even though he does have a stack of toys on his back, but like a little fur hat, his little clay pipe, and so on, his little buckle shoes. But the poem finally hit it super big when it was published on the cover of Harper's New Monthly Magazine in December 1857, which was a national magazine with circulation of over 50,000. Right? Previously, the poem had been printed in New York. Now it's in a national magazine for the December issue of a whole bunch of a Christmas garland of American poems, and here it is on the cover with this new illustration by a guy named F.O.C. Darley, which you can see this illustration seems a little bit more like a traditional Santa Claus. Again, he's kind of small. Obviously, the poem describes Santa Claus as very small, so he can fit down a chimney, right? And he's got miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. But anyway, Darley's version of Santa Claus is maybe a little bit more recognizable here. So while Santa Claus was becoming the big thing in New York, in Pennsylvania, he was still known as Kris Kringle. And Kris Kringle actually beat Santa vis-a-vis the print game because he appeared in three children's books in the 1840s. Kris Kringle's one called Kris Kringle's Book. This one here, Kris Kringle's Christmas Tree. Um, not not a very traditional looking Christmas tree. Does not appear to be coniferous for one thing. It's very bare. I don't know. Also, Kris Kringle, what the heck? I don't know. What does this look? I don't know. But, and then also Kris Kringle's Rarey Show for good boys and girls. Rarey shows were puppet shows or other kind of like lowbrow entertainment shows. So these were three of the first five Christmas books for kids published in America. The other two we've already discussed: The Children's Friend and The Night Before Christmas. Meanwhile, Kris Kringle was making personal appearances at Philadelphia department stores by 1841, with J.W. Parkinson's department store declaring itself Kris Kringle headquarters in 1846. Santa Claus, by contrast, didn't start appearing in department stores until 1890, when he visited the Boston store in Brockton, Massachusetts. That's the first department store appearance of a Santa Claus. But anyway, by the time of the Civil War, Christmas became pretty much universally accepted among all the states, including ones who had previously outlawed it, thanks in part to national publications like Harper's publishing stories and illustrations of Santa Claus, which helped solidify new American traditions from diverse regional practices, right? You take all the different regional things, they're starting to congeal into an American version. And then finally in 1870, Congress finally declared Christmas a federal holiday. But Santa still didn't quite look like Santa, right? In early illustrations for Moore's poem, he generally either looks like a Dutchman, like a Dutch sailor here. I don't know. He's pipe. He's got this little kind of goatee, beard. His sleigh looks like a boat. I don't know. Anyway, or else he's this kind of like weird little elf man, like this again, based on Moore's description of him as small enough to jump up and down a chimney, right? This one to me looks very much like the Hide the Pain Herald meme. That's the vibe I get from his face. Meanwhile, depictions of the Pennsylvanian Kris Kringle, he's more of a little fat gnome. Think of the one climbing the tree as well. Yeah, I don't know. This is The Night Before Christmas, obviously a visit from St. Nicholas. But this is for Pennsylvania. This is from the department store, the Kris Kringle headquarters, right? And so they have to use the name Kris Kringle, which is what's known in their state. Then you get weird stuff like this beardless Santa Claus playing a fiddle, dancing on the chimney, or this one that P.T. Barnum made, where he looks like George Washington on a flying broomstick. This was to promote a singing tour by this lady, Jenny Lind. That's Santa Claus. Okay, and then you got this one where he's beardless still. He's riding a sleigh pulled by a turkey, and then it's got like bottles of wine or something here on the front, and then are children pulling it? What's happening? I don't know. But while some of the other Harper's illustrations got us closer to a recognizable Santa, it was really this guy right here, Thomas Nast, political cartoonist, famous. Otherwise he was the guy who created the idea of using the elephant and the donkey for the Republicans and Democrats. His political illustrations are often credited with taking down corrupt political bosses like Boss Nast. Stuff like that. Anyway, this guy, he's the one who kind of nails down the look of Santa Claus in a really forward way, in a series of illustrations that he made over 2 decades for Harper's. Nast was born in Germany, and his take on Santa was explicitly, in his own words, based on the Belsnickel he knew growing up. Strangely, his first illustration of Santa Claus for Harper's Weekly, 1863, in the middle of the Civil War. It shows him giving presents to Union troops, right? Welcome, Santa Claus. Here he is, and he's got a Stars and Stripes style uniform here, and he's mostly got his back turned to us. But soon, by 1866, he was doing illustrations that were more focused on Santa himself, including this 2-page spread. You can see here Santa Claus and his works. Nast's earliest Santa Claus drawings depicted him as very small. You can see here, hey guys, jumping back, Boss Tweed is what I meant to say, is the name of the political boss. Boss Tweed from Tammany Hall. I got confused because of Thomas Nast and also the Star Wars guy. Boss Nast made me say that. Boss Tweed. Please no corrections. I'm not going to edit it. I'm doing it live. You should know by now. Boss Tweed. Anyway, all right, so his Santa Claus is very small. Look at how small he is compared to this book, right, for example. In these illustrations across the years, Nast is responsible for quite a bit of Santa lore, including the idea of him having a workshop at the North Pole. Where does North Pole come from? It comes from Nast. He thought that was a good place for someone who, if he goes to the whole world, he shouldn't belong to any one nation. He should live somewhere where he can get to everywhere, right? And but also reading letters from kids, having a naughty list and a nice list. You can see his pile of good letters from good kids and letters from bad kids. Really funny. As time goes on, he's influenced by English illustrations of Father Christmas and German depictions of this guy right here, Herr Winter, Lord Winter, who would eventually morph into the Weihnachtsmann with other Christmas gift bringers in Germany. He's got the look of what many American collectors would call a Belsnickel. A Belsnickel is a name for a hooded Santa-style guy with his arms crossed and then a Christmas tree in the crook of his arm, right? If you're an American like antiques collector, that would be called a Belsnickel, but this is Herr Winter. But anyway, Nast sees Father Christmas, some of the Father Christmas illustrations we looked at last time, Herr Winter, and so he starts drawing Santa as a grown-ass man. This is the most famous Thomas Nast Santa. You've seen it. He draws him as a full-sized adult man, finally taller than he is wide, rather than a tiny elf, right? This later Nast Santa was more like a jolly grandfather. This one's really nice. I like this one. And this is the version that sticks. Nast is also, he originally does, a variety of colored suits. Red is the one that sticks. By 1890, Santa Claus is everywhere. This is not a Nast illustration, but this is a Parker Brothers picture puzzle. I wanted to show you how he's used in advertising and toys and games and stuff. National circulation of books, periodicals, mass production of toys, and such makes it possible to codify ideas about a guy who had previously been broken up into dozens of regional traditions. In 1902, you have Wizard of Oz author L. Frank Baum writing The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus, which rules. It gives an origin for Santa that has nothing to do with being a bishop in Myra. Most of the lore did not stick, however. Pretty much none of it. He doesn't, if you ask anybody, where does Santa live? The North Pole, not the Laughing Valley of Ho-Ha-Ho, which is what Baum says. How many reindeer? 8. Baum says 10. What are their names? Dasher and Dancer, etc. Baum says Reckless, Speckless, and so on. He's got 10 names. Anyway, still very fun. Most of that lore didn't stick. Anyway, finally, in the 20th century, the look of Santa Claus is fully polished, refined by illustrators such as Norman Rockwell and J.C. Landecker, both drawing for the Saturday Evening Post. And then, perhaps most famously, Haddon Sundblom. Notice that I am saying his name very last of all the things. Here we are at the end of this video. Here I am saying it last because I want you to feel the weight of everything that came before him. he is important. He does depict a completely iconic Santa. But the next time somebody tells you that Coca Cola invented Santa Claus, please tell them to shut up. Please tell them to kick rocks. Because no, incorrect. If they say Santa Claus is red and white because of Coca Cola, incorrect. Not true. Anyway. Soon comes Rudolph and Frosty and the Grinch and all that, but you don't need me to tell you about those dudes. You already know. So that's it. American Christmas. Where did Santa Claus come from? Where did he not come from? But next time, if Christmas is just day 1 of 12, what comes next? That's what we're looking at next time. Until then, have a good Christmas.